Hello and welcome back to Land of Hope and Dreams. We are on day 7. This is our 15th out of 16th panels and discussions, and it's been amazing. All the work that we put into it has paid off beyond our wildest dreams. And my YouTube video just started playing in the background, so I need to turn that off. Got caught with a technical glitch. There we go. Let me start again. Anyway, thanks again for joining us in our celebration of Dave Marsh's work and vision. Music journalism, rock criticism, and his work on Sirius Radio is at the center of what Dave has done. This event has been about all the ways in which Dave has taken his work and vision out into the world, building bridges between music and politics, between audiences and performers, and always working towards social justice and activism. And that's been reflected in everyone who has spoken or will speak at this event. At this point, I want to point out that on the Land of Hope and Dreams website, we now have a readings tab and a videos tab. All the videos of the panels are on the videos tab, and all the recommended readings that we did around each panel and discussion are listed on the readings tab. And at the top of that readings tab, there is a wonderful piece called Dave Marsh's Dream. It's something we discovered from an email list from 2007. And if you're looking for a vision statement, so to speak, from Dave Marsh, that's where you'll find it. So go to landofhopeanddreams.co and click on the readings page. I'd like to thank the steering committee again for doing such an amazing job in pulling this together. Danny Alexander, Chris Buhalis, Charles Hughes, Susan Martinez, Lauren Anke, Alexander Shashko, Craig Werner, and Daniel Wolf. And David Cantwell was also there from the beginning with an idea to do something to celebrate Dave's work. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Afro-American Studies Department, for their help in spreading the word, and Karen Rose for the help in spreading the word on social media. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. The chat is turned off, but the Q&A is open. So please, if you have any questions for our panelists, put them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure the panelists get those questions at the end of the discussion. One last thing, but very important. We encourage you to contribute to the Kristen Ann Carr Fund. We've been able to put this entire event on, free to attend, but if you want to throw a few bucks somewhere worthwhile, the Kristen Ann Carr Fund is a great place to do it. It's the foundation that Dave Marsh and Barbara Carr set up nearly 30 years ago in memory of their late daughter, who passed away from a rare sarcoma, and it raises money for sarcoma research and funding sarcoma fellows who then go out across the country and do the work of helping people with sarcoma get the resources that they need. So we'll paste a link to that in the chat, and in the chat we'll also be pasting links from works from our wonderful group of panelists today. Before we go to those panelists, I'd like to share a video before each of our panels. We've been sharing videos, musicians, singers, songwriters sharing their thoughts about Dave Marsh, but also performances. And Craig Werner, who's moderating today's panel, selected a wonderful piece from Shoshana Pavlik, who is the daughter of Ed Pavlik, a poet and professor who came out of the University of Wisconsin Afro-American Studies Department, as did I and Alexander Shashko and others here on the steering committee. And we think it's a great place to start. So I'm going to share this video from Shoshana Pavlik now, and then Alexander Shashko will introduce the panel.
Just a waste of time, waste of words. Loving's a fairy tale, let me tell you why. Things you would say to me, places you wanted me to be, changing me so comfortably. Regret I knew you, but I wasted wine, wasted wine. Loving's a fairy tale, let me tell you why. Show me the perfect way, perfect weather, you know I try. I was looking just to fake it. You know my type. 'Cause I was looking for the basic. You know I like. 'Cause I was looking just to make it through the night, through the weekend, through the work, through the day, man. Looking for the faking it. You know I like.
Thanks, Sushana, for that beautiful song, one of many beautiful songs and words that you have written. And I know that because you were one of my students in the Department of Afro-American Studies. And in that sense, you are part of the lineage of Dave Marsh as a teacher and mentor through me, but also more directly from Dave to Craig Werner, to your father, Ed, who was one of Craig's students, and onward to yourself. I didn't have to grade your papers. They were so good that you could have taught the class. And it's really a tribute to all of those mentors that you are part of this broader story in such a positive and compelling way. It's also a reminder that Dave's reach extends far beyond the people who know him directly or know him well. And that is particularly true of younger generations. Younger generations who have read his work without knowing him, younger generations who know of the themes of his work, of his political work and his activism, his fight against cancer, and also through him as well. You know, one of the things about Dave is that he has always responded really strongly to young artists with fresh, open ears, and they've always responded to him. All you have to do is ask any kid who's ever been around Dave, and they'll tell you how well they remember him and how profoundly he was part of their life. He always made time for them. In this conversation last night with Daniel Wolf, Dave said that the job of all of us is to teach our people. So I hope that that's where we begin today. And leading that conversation and that teaching today is my dear friend and mentor, Craig Werner. Craig is the author of A Change Is Gonna Come, Music, Race, and the Soul of America, and We Gotta Get Out of This Place, the soundtrack of Vietnam, along with Doug Bradley, which won the Rolling Stone Music Book of the Year Award in 2015. He is an emeritus professor of Afro-American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he has worked on all kinds of community education projects with K through 12 teachers, with veterans, low-income adults, education in prisons. He is truly a scholar, both in the academic classroom and far, far beyond it. So we couldn't have a better person to lead this conversation today. He is every bit the mentor and inspiration to countless people that Dave is, and to Dave. I should add that the two of them, I think, connected, and probably Craig will talk about this a little more, I hope he does, through the work that both of them have done. He also mentored Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, and I want to take a moment on behalf of the organizing committee to thank Eric for all the work that he has done this week. I could go on about each member of the organizing committee and all of the specific and wonderful things that they did to make this event possible. But Eric has put in countless hours and countless time, not just putting together the creative side of this, but also the technical side of it. Eric is a fantastic music writer and critic, but he also knows how to run a conference, both online and in person, if you ever need him to do that. And if not for him, we would have held this conference probably with tin cans and strings. He really made this possible. And so I want to thank him on behalf of not just the committee, but everyone who's had the opportunity to watch this week. Thanks, Eric, for everything that you have done. And so with that, I want to pass it along to Craig Werner so we can get this conversation started.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Appreciate the words. I feel and this panel is the outgrowth of the entire Land of Hopes and Dreams event to this moment. Education has come up again and again and again. The keynote from Steve Van Zandt and Jackson Brown was basically a conversation about education. Vernon Reed and Val Den and Felix Pollock engaged it. Ernie Perez gave a great statement on education a while back. Nona Hendricks ended her keynote conversation with Bruce Springsteen about education. There's a certain level on which it's simply what Dave does. I was going to actually start by reading a quote from James Baldwin's terrific essay, A Talk to Teachers, right now. But listening to the panels, I decided not to, mostly to save time for what it really matters. We're just talking about the issues that came up. If you have not read the essays from Luis Rodriguez, which are posted on our site, read them, particularly if you're a teacher or an educator. When we started putting this event together, the first two names that I threw into the hat, I said, we have to have Luis Rodriguez here. And then Ernie Perez was second on that. And Carvel Holloway, who's on the panel right now, is a member of their amazing, amazing educational circle. But I think we're going to probably spend less time talking about Dave on this panel than has been the case on most, because I know he wanted us to talk about the ideas, and that's at the center of the work that all of our panelists have done. I'm going to introduce them briefly in alphabetical order, beginning with Holly Gleason. Holly is a journalist, an educator, a songwriter. She's won awards from the Country Music Association and the International Association of Street Papers. She has done artist development work, and people she's worked with sound like people who fill the mixes I make when I want to feed my soul, the country music part of me particularly. Patty Loveless, Rodney Corral, the late great John Prine, who she's working on a book right now. She teaches at Middle Tennessee State University, which, whatever you're imagining, isn't what Tennessee State University is. It's very important in the music education world. I'm sure Holly will be talking about that. Second, we have Carvel Holloway, who's trombonist. I'm particularly glad to have Carvel here because we've had a scattering of working musicians over this set of events, probably not as many as we should have had. And Carvel is both an educator and a musician. He's taught in middle schools and high schools, which is going to be very important to what we're talking about on this panel. And he works with the Compton Music Conservatory and the jazz hip hop group Strokely. Third is Luis Rodriguez. I could spend the rest of the hour talking about how important Luis Rodriguez has been to me. He probably doesn't even remember meeting me when he came to Madison early in my career as a teacher, but he's been a part of every classroom that I have taught in since then on many, many levels. His memoir, Always Running, I love, in one of the essays he talks about what he takes greatest pride in is that it's been stolen from more school libraries than any other book anybody can think of, which tells you something very, very important. He has a book of essays, I believe it's recently come out, From Land to Our Land, Essays, Journeys, and Imaginings of a Native Chicanx Writer. The final member of the panel today is Alexander Shashko. I didn't actually write anything about Alexander, which I'm now wishing I had. I just know Alexander so well in the circles we're talking about. We have been exploiting Alexander's labor in the Department of Afro-American Studies for quite some time now. I created a class, Afro-American Studies 156, on Black music and American cultural history, which was a very, very popular class for many years. And now more than a decade ago, I handed it off to Alexander, who understands issues like how music platforms work and has younger children than I do, keeping his ears fresh. He is an amazing teacher. He's also, in the spirit of Dave Marsh, has done wonderful work with digital communities, setting up discussions of music, of what music means, that at times in the evolution of digital platforms, I think we're literally the most exciting high-level conversations on music going on in the world. He's a friend, fabulous, fabulous teacher, Alexander Shashko. And I meant to mention, excuse me, with Holly, that the paperback version of her book, Walk the Line, How the Women of Country Music Change Our Lives, is coming out reasonably soon from the University of Texas Press. Again, that issue of why music matters, how we take it into our lives, is at the core of what we're talking about with music and education. I want to begin by asking everybody for their Dave origin story, just so we don't forget about him on the panel, not likely to happen. But before I say that, I do want to give props here to Luis for the title of this panel. I think we just had it as music and education when we started out. And when I started communicating with the panelists, he wrote back, it said the title should be music and education where teaching and learning should meet. Amen. But let's begin with Dave origin stories. And Holly, I know you've got a good one. So let's begin with yours.
I was at the New Music Seminar as the token woman on the music critics panel. And I had been pushed out a window at a daily paper by a writer that needed my job. And I realized he was there. And I started to have a little panic attack. And Dave's like, it's fine. It's fine. The guy gets up and asks the question about how close is too close and how can you have integrity and be objective when you know these people. And Dave basically slayed the dragon. It was fantastic. And I walked out of that room always core knowing, how can you write about, how can you understand, how can you contextualize something if you don't know who they are in their heart and in their truth?
Yeah. Carvel.
Hey, I want to go back to what Alexander Shashko was said earlier about Dave, in that his support and mentorship really in ways that he probably doesn't know. That when we put together Rockamole, and I was I was, just trying to experiment and figure out original music on my own, and through jazz and hip hop. He was very supportive of that, and I didn't even know him or know who he was. And then when I found out who he was and found out how the important writer that he is, I later met him. I think it was in DC, and it was important that I was able to just sit and hang out with him. I think I've only met Dave in person once or twice in person, but just the ability to to converse with someone, and their support and knowing who they are and what they represent is extremely important. And I know we're going to get into that in this panel, because that is really a strong part of education. And I teach in public schools in Compton and that type of thing. We're all about, what you're supposed to teach and everything. But the most important thing, and I know Luis will talk about this, is that connection, and it really meant something as to who he is and how I was able to connect with him and his support. So I think that was the most important thing to me.
Luis.
Well, I actually met him through Bruce Springsteen. I was working as a writer and a journalist in '84 when Springsteen did the Born in the USA tour, and he was touring all the Rust Belt cities. But somebody must have told him the biggest Rust Belt city is not in the Rust Belt. It was Los Angeles. So somehow he shows up in LA, and I used to work in the steel mills and in the auto plants and in the refineries of LA for many, many years before it started to go away. The deindustrialization of this country, which what's Born of the USA was all about. And so he came to the local steel hall that we were at, and I was still engaging with these guys that I used to work with. Even though now I was a journalist, I was still there. And that's how I met Bruce. But through Bruce, I met one of his managers, Barbara Carr, who's married to Dave Marsh. And that's how I got to meet Dave Marsh. And to make a long story short, we've been friends ever since. Dave Marsh mentioned me in Bruce Springsteen's book about Bruce Springsteen, Glory Days. And Bruce himself mentioned me in his last memoir, because through those years, I kept developing a relationship. I wrote some pieces for Rock and Roll Confidential, Dave Marsh's amazing newsletter. And I also was able to create a culture center here in the San Fernando Valley 20 years ago that I asked Dave to see about talking to Bruce to help us out. And I was very surprised. Of course, Dave was gung-ho and happy, but that Bruce also came through and he's given us support. I was at several concerts that he did. I got to go on free, including for the Steelworkers, but also for Tia Chucha Centro Cultural, which is my bookstore, culture center. And I think Bruce did the last concert at the sports arena before it got torn down. And Dave had his radio show there. And I was on the panel on the radio show on that very last day. So I would have to say that Dave is just one of my heroes as far as how to use writing, to use ideas, to really open the door to the social changes we need.
Amen. Alexander.
Well, I met Dave on one of those aforementioned digital platforms, the annual music discussion that I ran for a couple of decades. I think probably Craig invited him, someone did, invited him to that platform. And what made it so much fun was that although I knew Dave's work, I had read it for years, I did not really know his reputation for mixing it up. Like I didn't know how much he liked to sort of, really dig in and have deep conversations and sometimes combative conversations with people. So I didn't know any better. And I went ahead and just decided, hey, this is my platform. So we're just going to have these conversations and these arguments and agreements and disagreements. And yeah, my guess is that he probably liked that I didn't know any better than to go ahead and dive in, because I think some people were pretty cautious about that otherwise. And we agreed about more than we disagreed about, which I think probably went a long way, along with Detroit family roots, which came in handy in a pinch. But in any event, that's really how I got to know Dave. And the one thing I do want to say about that moment when I got to know him, because of course I've hung around him in person many, many times and know about how generous he is as a person and how thoughtful he is, was that on those digital platforms, when I originally set them up, they were just for my friends. I didn't really have professional writers or critics or even, for the most part, historians in those groups. They were just there for my friends to talk about music every year. And they stayed even after the music writers and the historians and the critics showed up. And what I remember is how seriously Dave took what everybody wrote, regardless of their background, regardless of their base of knowledge. And I think that speaks not just to Dave's background, but also two other things. First of all, something that James Bernard mentioned in the last panel, which was that Dave seeks out new voices, even when he has no reason to do so, right? He's plenty established and he doesn't need to do that. And yet he's always willing to do that. But also something that I think Grail Marcus said, it might have been Bob Christgau, but I think it was Grail who said it the other day, which was that Dave has always had a different audience for his writing and for the work that he does that was not just about the professionals, was not just about the writers and the critics and the historians, but was about ordinary people outside of that, music fans and otherwise, who just wanted to have a conversation and share their thoughts. And the seriousness with which he listened to what they had to say and then engaged them, I think is something that I've held with me for a long time and have tried to emulate myself.
Yeah. As we move into the education part of the panel, I want to begin by just nodding to something that I think is in the background on all of our heads as we think about these issues. Luis, this comes from your essay. I picked up the quote where you talk about the way that school systems usually operate, which is to tell kids something to the effect of don't think, don't interact, don't react. If you show your humanity, you'll be punished. If you show your care, you'll be reprimanded. If you show you're independent but knowledgeable, you'll be ostracized. And then you break that down into Mark Twain's, we should not let schooling get in the way of education. Amen. That's something that Dave Marsh believes very, very deeply. And I think that that's going to be just kind of a background premise on everything else we're saying, that we're not talking about schools here. We're talking about education. Schools will come into it. But they're not the point here. And I think how I'd like to start that piece is just with Luis's title, Music and Education, where teaching and learning should meet. And Luis, I'd like to start out by asking you what you had in mind with that. And then I'll go around and ask how for the rest of you that applies to the places where you do your educating. Luis.
Well, let me start by saying that I think learning and teaching is innate to humanity. It's always been there. It's part of who we are. We're always learning. We're always, from what we learn, we teach. And I think that I call it the spirit because it's what's missing in our schools. That spirit that's natural to all of us. You don't have to teach people to want to learn. They are natural learners. It's innate. So what happens though, however, is, and you can see it with kids and the way they even try to get language and the way they understand things, they're learning all the time. Schooling, unfortunately, loses that spirit. And it starts with losing the spirit of teaching that also begins to undermine the spirit of learning. So by the time you're in middle school, even high school, there's no spirit for education. It's all about the test. It's all about the curriculum. It's all about discipline. It's all about a lot of other things and nothing about learning. And that's where I'm trying to get at, that they have to come together for this to be called education. You can't separate either one of those things. And a good learner is a good teacher, and a good teacher is a good learner.
Amen. Carvel, you're in Luis's sphere out there. How do you think about that?
Well, first, I want to thank you for Luis for writing that, and you all for using the two readings for this, because I think I certainly agree, and framing things the way that you're framing things. It's interesting that Luis talks in his writing about in adolescence, we want to turn that off. We don't want to deal with the adolescent period. I taught for 17 years in Compton. I still teach in Compton. I teach during the pandemic, right before the pandemic, they sent me to high school. So I'm a high school teacher now, but I taught middle school for 17 years in Compton. And it's critical. That's a critical time in the development of youth. And it's exactly when we start telling kids no, 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 no. And it's exactly when we need to start listening to what kids are doing and actually helping to guide and mentor and shape and allow them to figure things out, because you don't figure the world out by people telling you no. And well, Luis writes really, really well about this. I love what you wrote. You talk about Trini and Andrea, your daughter and wife, how the school system pushed them out because of the way that they have we're taught, we're told actually as our job, what we have to do. And for me, I just don't listen to that. I love teaching. I'm actually a person who never wanted to teach. I didn't like school. I'm not a person who was seriously into academics and stuff like that. I love music, and most of my music I learned outside of school. But I really love working with students, and I always have. I worked when I first started teaching. I was a teacher assistant for a non-public school in Alhambra, where they used to send like the troubled kids from East LA and South Central LA, and Luis was. We read Luis's book, Always Running, and he was so gracious to come out and talk to my students after we read the book. He sat down and we just had lunch together, and the kids got to ask him whatever kind of questions they wanted to about the book. And these were like they're the kids everybody throws away. It's those things that are important. It's this is what I talked about earlier, that mentor, that connection, because what we're actually teaching has to do with life. you need to learn how to read, you need to learn math, and you need to learn how to create, but when you tell kids to no and shut things off, you just lose them. They just leave, they just tune out. And you have to be able to hear that and listen to them before you can do anything else. So like I said, the James Baldwin reading really goes into this in a very strong way too. I thank you all for framing these things the way that you did. And Luis, thanks for what you wrote. I absolutely agree with how we're framing things here, because I teach in public school and have been for 19 years, but those things are what's most important.
Holly, I saw you nodding some there. Your turn.
When I started, I'm an adjunct, so I'm the lastest of the teachers on this panel. When Beverly Keel, who was running the recording industry management program, called me to teach entertainment reporting, I asked if it could be music criticism instead. I wanted kids to not just do a checklist of tasks, but I wanted them to think about it. And when I got in there, I was shocked at how upsetting asking juniors and seniors in college to think was. I had some kids just shut down on me. And what was stunning was everything you're talking about. When I was reading your essays, Louise, I was like, this is the problem. This is what happened. Now I understand my students, these poor kids. And it's interesting watching them go through their gears, especially the high achieving kids. I had an honor roll student tell me she needed a rubric. And I'm like, this isn't fill in the blanks or a checklist. This is music criticism. What do you think about it? What do you feel? Get to your heart. And you would see as the semester went on every single year, the lights coming on and seeing people get excited. And the idea that we teach music criticism or reporting, it's turned in over the years, which I thought it was a throwaway elective. This is a place where kids learn to think, and that it's good to think, and it's important to think. And we have some of those spirited Dave Marsh conversations in my classroom. And I think knowing Dave, I let him go because they need to not fear that either. It's powerful. So yeah, when I got the reading, as everybody knows, I was like, we should all just be quiet, let Louise speak. Because I mean, it was like, preach. So I'll be nodding a lot today.
Alexander.
Well, obviously I have somewhat similar experiences to what Holly has, both in terms of my position and in terms of the kinds of students who I see. By the time students get to a university or get to a college, they have a certain amount invested in the system. They've learned to navigate it, and maybe have even found some investment in it. But as everyone who's been around higher education knows, through the years, the practicality of getting a college education has overshadowed the very idea of education itself. And I think what I try to do, and when I think about where learning and teaching come together, is just an expression of joy in the ideas, in the things that you're teaching about. I mean, that's what helps get them to think as well. And that if you express the joy that you have in the subject matter, they will respond in kind. And that's an important part of the dynamic, because in so many cases, in so many classes, that doesn't get conveyed, either because, frankly, a lot of professors have not really been taught how to do that, even if they have that joy, and also because we're kind of encouraged at times not to convey it. It helps that I teach about music and about history and about subjects that are not, for most of the students, directly applicable to the degree that will get them a job. It gives them a moment to breathe. It gives them a moment to think about being a citizen. It gives them a moment to think about being educated and being scholars in a sense. I hear back a lot about how, it was the one class that they got to take that made them feel like the college student they imagined that they would be. And that's not necessarily just because of the way I teach it or the subject matter, but just because so much of the rest of it has a different purpose now. And so I think conveying that joy is a big part of it. And I think about Dave in that sense too. One of the things about Dave is that he has always conveyed joy in music without trivializing it. And that's something that I know Craig does, and I know that I try to do too. You know, don't tell a bunch of stories about the various different shenanigans that artists have engaged in. You know, that trivializes it. That turns it into a story of fame instead of a story of art. But convey to people that you care about it, and if you do that, they'll buy in and they'll invest in it too.
And I think just as the culture trains kids out of learning, it also pretty aggressively trains kids out of hearing, which in the musical world is super important to all of us in different ways. And I was wondering how you confront that in the educational work you do. How do you get people to forget about what they just read in the comments section on whatever they're getting their feed from, get the music as anecdote out of the way and actually hear what the hell is there? And Carvel, I think I'll start with you since you're dealing with people who actually have to play the stuff.
Yeah, that's, I'm laughing because one of the most difficult things for me, not for me, but for me as a teacher, is getting students to accept that whatever you do is going to be okay. And we're going to work with it from there. We're going to start from there. And you're not going to start out by being great. And you're not going to, and whatever, you know, it's tough. I taught middle school for 17 years. And then right at this pandemic, I was sent to high school. So I haven't really had an honest teaching experience with my high school students. But they were supposed to have students on Zoom for 2 hours at a time. And quite honestly, I just don't think I don't think that makes sense for high school students in Compton that I'm working with. In fact, all the time I have them join, and they very often, I'm looking at a ceiling if I'm looking at anything at all. When they unmute, you can hear kids, you can hear the next teacher, there's all these things going on. So I just created a way that I can have students, I can give them the assignments. I stay on Zoom, they can come back and I'm there for the full 2-hour class because we're on block schedule. But sign in with me and then leave and go do my assignment. And a lot of them don't get it done that day, or they get it done. I accept it whenever they turn it in. This is not what I'm supposed to do, but this is what I mean by I just ignore what I'm told, and partly because I teach music, no one really cares, and they don't really pay attention to what I do. Very often does a principal call me on anything, but the reason I bring that up here is that I had them watch this the Social Dilemma, which some may know that came out, and it's about social media, and it's partly about is going over why you can't get away from your cell phone. You have to be on that phone all the time, and why, and for them why it's so important to get likes, or or why bullying and so these things happen, and why people are so angry at each other and all these things. And I had them watch it, and I pose questions to it, and it's a lesson, but I don't try to I want to see what they have to say, and I want them to be able to express what they have to say. And I'm not trying to change their ideas. Matter of fact, many of them say, "Well, isn't everything marketing? When we watch TV, isn't that marketing?" So I just want them to think. But it's important because it's very difficult for anyone. You have to try and feel some sense of self-worth. And when everything around you, everyone around you is telling you you ain't shit, you know, it's gonna come out in all kinds of different ways how you try and get up and be seen. So I don't take it, you know, in a classroom. Again, I go back to you have to create a space where you're hearing and listening, and allow students to create and mess up and figure things out. I wasn't able to teach. I would usually be teaching band instruments. I've recently started teaching more rhythm section, you know, the guitar, bass, and drums, and also electronic music, just so that students can figure out how to create in whatever way they want. I still have band. I have a traditional band. I have I will have a jazz band. I've had a jazz band, and they'll be they're writing songs. We deal with just lyrics sometimes. So just as many options as I can, but allowing them to just express and not and figure out how to express and not care about what comes back at them when they express, and just celebrate that. It's really, really important, you know, for my job, for what I do.
Holly, how's that play into your world? The listening thing? Mute.
It makes me laugh and it makes me smile, because that's the other thing, getting kids to be brave enough to speak their truth. And, you know, you can't tell today, but I'm funny. And I spend a lot of time cracking jokes in class. So I make messing up just like one more joke in class. And I think when they realize it's okay to make a mistake, when, you know, my line is, and we're all going to laugh at you, don't worry. We're here to laugh and learn and rock out. And one of the things that I think is so rich that Carvel, you kind of reached into, is the things kids find out they like to listen to. Being Middle Tennessee state, we do get kids that want to go into the country music business. But if anybody looks at the Apple City charts, country music doesn't show up on those charts. So you get all kinds of kids, and we're a state school. We're not Christian schools where Christian parents pay a lot of money to keep their Christian children safe as they learn about the music business. So it's a pretty wide spectrum. And that's the other thing I love, is by using music as the template, they find each other and they start having conversations about stuff they'd never considered. So, yeah.
Alexander.
Well, I think that when I think about this question about how to get student, or sort of, you know, encourage students to listen, and also how to get them to slow down amidst the churn of information that they're being bombarded with, you know, I do turn to history. I sort of am asking them to stop and say, why is this here? Why is this song here? Why is this artist popular? Why did this happen when it happened? Not is it good or is it bad? Absolutely, encouraging a conversation about that is worthwhile, but so is trying to give it some context. If there's one thing that I've learned through the years teaching both political history and the history of music, it's that you are going to have more fruitful conversations if people have a sense of the context, if they have a sense of the history, where a song fits into the broader narrative, because it brings the temperature down. Then it isn't something new. It isn't an assault on their senses. It isn't coming out of ignorance or from some other place or some other population that they know nothing about. And so if you can encourage that kind of contextual understanding, it really helps them to slow down a little bit. and think about what they like and think about what they care about and why they care about it. How does it connected to their own past, to their own history, to their own families? I mean, one of the best things about teaching about music, and I'm sure everyone can speak to this, is that the students go back and talk to their families, to their siblings, to their parents, their friends, their coworkers, about the hits that are on the radio at the moment, or about the songs that their grandparents listen to, and they make connections and they find a sense of commonality where maybe those differences were broader before. And so to me, that's how you really create good listening, is to create a kind of sensibility for listening critically, and then to find the love within that kind of context.
Luis.
I like the word encouragement because it has courage in it. And I think that's one of the things that teachers try to do. They're bringing out the courage in their own kids, but they have to have courage. They have to have courage to withstand whatever's going to come at them. They have to have courage not to be taken off track, not to lose focus, even though there's all kind of things. So I think listening is also important because it's about attunement. You're tuning to the emotions, the energies in the classroom, or to wherever you're teaching. You're tuning into where is this energy over here going this way and the other one over here. You have to address all of it. I call it reading a room. When you walk into a classroom, when you walk into a setting, you got to kind of quickly read the room. Who's there, who's what's happening, and then know how to respond adequately to those various energies. And I'll give you a couple examples. I've been, besides going to schools and everything else, I've been teaching in prisons for 40 years. It's one of the things I love to do. And creative writing mostly, but it's really about healing. It's really about creative thinking, creative living. And one of the things that happens is sometimes I go around the country and they send me around. I'll give you an example of how sometimes it does take courage. So I was in North Carolina and they wanted me to come into a big juvenile prison, but it was juvenile up to age 25. So they were adults, but they were hard-end murders. There was about 200 of them at the top floor, 8th floor of this big giant prison. All African-American kids, mostly white, poor kids, some Latinos, but mostly African-American. And I wanted to go speak with them, and they gave them copies of my book, Always Running. And so the impression I think that they had was that I was this hardcore, scarred-faced gangster, because they read Always Running. They go, oh man, this guy. So they were waiting for this tough guy, maybe coming with a trench coat or something, a nice little brim hat. I came in there just walking in like a regular guy, and they started laughing, all of them, 200 people. Because I look like a regular schmo. I look like their uncle. I look like somebody just off the street, the janitor, and they're laughing, and people sometimes will walk away from that, but I'm going right through all the laughter. It doesn't bother me because I know what's going to happen. I go up there and I go in front of them, and then I tell my story. Then I talk about what I know. And they know, it's like they say, gangster, gets gangster. They get it. They see when you've been there. They see the reality. You can't play with it. You can't pretend. If you pretend, you're lost. Any teacher knows you got to be authentic. If you're not authentic, you're gone. So I just be as real as I can. And it doesn't mean I try to be tough or hard or anything. I just tell the real story that is complex, and they get it. And by the time I got through, all those 200 guys up there were giving me a standing ovation. And the reason I just mentioned this story is because, again, tuning in to everything that's happening, having the courage to withstand whatever comes in, but also, as was mentioned earlier, how do you encourage people themselves to have that own courage? So one of the things that happened is several people got up, because in prison, if you're a poet, you're vulnerable, you're done. It's weakness. But when I read my poems, several guys got up and says, I got poems. And we gave them room to read their poetry. So to me, that's what's really important, is setting a conditions, an environment in which learning and courage comes hand in hand. Amen.
I've just finished teaching a course out of prison, south of Madison. It's on multicultural literature. And we taught Sherman Alexie and Jimmy Santiago Baca, Natalie Diaz, alongside Reginald Dwayne Betts and Etheridge Knight, to a mostly African-American class. And what the guys did is they took it and they made it into a creative writing seminar. Their responses, we recorded responses each week. And about 3 weeks in, they were no longer responding to the stories per se. They were writing their own stories there.
You know, there's another good connection with Dave here is that Wayne Kramer from MC5, Detroit, he started this thing called Jail Guitar Doors. I'm on their board. I know Wayne, he's here in LA and we're working together, but they started doing musical training in the prisons, bringing in instruments. And I met him because I was doing my creative writing classes right next to theirs. And some of the same people in my class were in his class, you know, doing the stuff. So prisons teaches you one important thing. There's a lot of different ways to learn. A lot of these guys probably didn't make it in schools, but they were intelligent, they were creative, they were capable. And that's what people forget. Some of these guys that you want to write off, some of these women you want to write off, they're actually, you can't write them off. They have their own intelligence that you have to know how to draw out.
Amen. Well, as I've been listening, I've been hearing calls and responses going back and forth. That's a paradigm that Alexander and I definitely use at the base of our teaching, that their artists are responding to their world. They put out the call. It's on us as the audience to respond to it. Our responses become the calls to the other people there, creates a space in the prison that makes it okay for the guys to write poetry there. And with that in mind, I mean, I could ask questions all afternoon, but I wanted to pause for a minute and ask the panelists if you guys have questions you want to ask each other at this point.
Well, I have a question I would like to ask Holly, which is how teaching in a classroom has, if it has, changed her work as a journalist, or how her work as a journalist has shaped how she works as a teacher.
Yes. Yes. One of the things when I started, because I was a college student and I wrote for the Miami Herald, I was really lucky. And I had an editor who was always very mindful about, we don't run this story because you want to write it. We run this story because 1 million people get this paper, some percentage of them want to read it. And it really hyper focused me teaching students as a journalist on how much opinion passes as fact and that need to really weight what you say and not just sling or assume people know, because it's the internet of babble out there. And it also really put me into a sense of, if you're going to write about it in any kind of long form, how does it make you feel? What does it ignite inside you? What kinds of things are you going to think about? Or should you take this music and maybe consider, you know, back to the context thing you were saying, you know, and the journalism for my students, I'm always challenging them to look at where their sources are and then to look at the filters and the prisms of those sources. You know, it's amazing to me how little they actually read. And one of the first things that I do every class is I say, where to get your news, social media, Twitter, whatever. And I'll be like, oh, so you follow your favorite artists, right? And they'll be like, yeah, you know, because I want it straight from the horse's mouth. And I'll say, well, how many of you guys have internships? And a lot of them do. And I said, how many of you guys are doing social media? And most of them do. And I said, so you're posting for artists, right? And you'll just watch everybody kind of go. I said, you don't think you're special, do you? Like, because you're so awesome. You're the only person posting for an artist. And I sort of hate telling them Santa Claus at the mall isn't real. But it's a nice way to sort of get them thinking. And then I'll take it a step further and say, so how many of you have actually met the artist you're social posting for? And no hands go up. But this is the one that's heartbreaking. I'll say, well, how many of you guys have read the bio of the artist you're posting for? And if I'm lucky, one hand goes up. So it helps them understand not to take things at face value, but why. And then they start, but halfway through, they'll start coming up and telling me where they read something, or I saw this, and what do you think? And I think to that incredible James Baldwin, I'll say, you know, you need to really reach in and think and find good people to teach you. And it's not necessarily the teachers.
Mhm.
But I didn't say that.
Let me build on that for the next question I had in my line, because I think it grows directly out of it. Former student Ed Pavlik, whose daughter we heard sing before this panel, teaches creative writing in some very unusual ways. He prize-winning poet, his mentors were Adrian Rich and Yusef Komanyaka, basically. Great people to learn for. Ed didn't take a single English class when he was a student. He took no poetry class. He just wrote his own stuff coming up. And was very lucky that Adrian Rich picked his book out of a stack for APR's best first book of poetry when she was judge. But when Ed teaches creative writing, he doesn't do any of the things that creative writers do. What he add in creative writing classes usually that make them so goddamn deadly. What he does is he tells the students over the course of this class, you're going to A, write, and B, their final paper is to put together their own writings and then to identify a figure who is their ancestor, a figure who is their elder, and a figure who is their creative relative. Ralph Ellison wrote about ancestors and relatives, saying, who are the people your age who are doing the same thing? We sound the same because we grew up at the same place. Your elders are more likely to be traditional teachers. Your ancestors are those, the origin points where it passes down. And again, Louise, I'm thinking about your essay on the way this works in indigenous communities particularly. I'd just like some of your thoughts on that. And Louise, could we start with you? Elders, ancestors, relatives.
Well, I think that's so important because, you know, to me, it's getting back to source. Everything that school doesn't really emphasize. I think the problem with schools, and I have to say, most of them are about the bottom line. And the bottom line is what we call masculine energy. Not to knock masculine energy out, but just to point out that it's the wrong place to start. In nature and among indigenous people, the feminine is the first primary energy. It's the first one. It's the answer to whether you have the egg or the chicken. The design comes first. However you want to see the design, however you want to see it by whatever God you think it is, design happens, and then things begin to implement its creation. That's why, you know, you have the egg and the sperm. You have all these things. You have to have both. But the first thing is the feminine. You know what I'm saying? So indigenous people understood that. So to me, the important thing is to open up the space for the imaginative part of it, to spend fuller in your imagination before you do the implementation of anything. And even when you're doing creative writing or even in any class, you have to engage the imagination more than anything, because that opens the door to how do I realize what I imagine? Hope I'm making sense. You know, in other words, you gotta use the feminine first, and the feminine is constant. But here's the other thing I will add, you know, is that even if you'd start with imagination, the design, whatever it is, and then you start thinking about the practical things to get it done, which is great. That's the organizing principle that masculine energy is about. You still got to intertwine the feminine in the masculine. Otherwise, you lose it. You know, it's like I tell people when set organizations, don't just have your vision, your mission, and then have your organization here, and then forget the vision and mission. You know, it has to be intertwined with what you're doing in the masculine energy side, the practical side, the realization side, how you implement things. So you teach people this beautiful concept that both those things are necessary for anything to be created.
Amen. When my wife asked why I was so excited about having you on my panel, the place I pointed her to was an essay you did on Robert Bly and the men's movement many years back, which is just a damn classic on what you were just talking about. Carvel, with this question of, you know, the lineage, elders, ancestors, relatives in mind, I think about jazz pedagogy and the fact that the great jazz teachers, you know, Miles Davis was a great teacher by putting guys in a room and doing nothing. Herbie Hancock said, Miles just let us play until we got to the point where we were heading for a dead end, and then he'd play a line to swerve us back. Art Blakey, one of the great teachers anywhere. How do you think about your place in this lineage?
Yeah, the thing is, he got to choose exactly who he put in the room with him, though. He said, "I want you. I want Coltrane. I want I want Herbie." He picked out who he was putting in that room. In our situation, just everybody walks in, and whoever they are, now we have to figure out what we're going to do. And I'm not sure if I'm going to directly answer your question, but to me, it's important to understand that you're always teaching, no matter what. And there are a lot of terrible teachers, because they're teaching that I don't care what you say, kid. I don't care about you. You need to understand what I'm teaching you, what I'm telling you, and but those people are teaching. They're teaching some terrible things, but they're teaching. And I, like Luis was talking about encouragement. Every student is not. You're not teaching the same thing to every student either. There's some. I mean, it's a very difficult job. I mean, I love my job, but it's a very, very difficult job. And you have 40 12-year-olds in a class, and none of them care about what you have to say when you first walk in, or 18 or 17-year-olds. And when they walked in the classroom, in my case, when they walk in the classroom, they think you're the terrible teacher, because everyone else, the other teachers who look just like me, or who doesn't have anything to do with look, they walked into a situation with the person in that room, a role, and they were treated like shit. So why would I be any different? And to me, I have to figure out how to get that group to work as a group, to understand each other, because music, and there's a reason that we're teachers, and we're coming from the standpoint of music and creativity and art. We don't ever, music is never a solitary thing. It's, even the guitarist who's at home, in his room, the ultimate thing is for that to go out to everybody. It's always a group activity, no matter what. Now, we all go back and practice. I practice every day, but it's always the goal to come back into a situation, with Herbie Hancock and whoever else, I'm always coming back to that group. And I love that analogy of jazz in that situation, because it is the ultimate in group creativity, because we're all going to improvise. We're all going to put our personal aspect into what we create together. And to me, a classroom, the best classroom, or what I'm trying to achieve in a classroom is that essence. In other words, how are we going to work together as a group to get whatever we're trying to get? Because every kid isn't trying to get the same thing. For some kids, whether they learn an instrument or not, it has nothing to do with the education they're going to get from that classroom. If they're just able to get to the end of the day, it's a great thing. If they just understand, bro, whatever you do, I'm still with you. You can call me whatever name you want. You can get pissed off, whatever. I mean, I've had fights, blow up, all that, but still, I'm still going to support you, and we're going to figure this out, and we're going to figure it out as a group. And the analogy that you're talking about with jazz, if we can figure out how to make music together and how to work together, then that is the education. And I teach how to read music. I do all the academic things or whatever, but that's not nearly as important as that aspect of of let's create together and work together as a group. And every classroom is different. And I think Luis, you know, I keep going back to him, but the fact that he can go in and read a room and figure out how to do that is exactly what a teacher, you know, a good teacher, I think, you know, is trying to figure, like you all have spoken to. That's what you're figuring out. Like Holly was saying, she puts these things in place so that now we can have an honest conversation about where we're going to go from there. Now we're working as a group. Now we're having a conversation, and it might look a little different, you know, with 12-year-olds, but that it's the same thing.
Amen. Holly.
You know, I think that's a big piece of it. And the idea that I think social media has also made it hard for kids to talk to strangers. One of the things that I noticed when we went to Zoom was my quiet students started participating more. And my lab mom students actually backed off a little bit because I guess they weren't worried about who was looking at them and how they were scanning. But the idea that you can get them to have a conversation, MTSU, one of the wonderful things about it, a lot of these kids are the first person in their family to be getting a college education. So it's important enough. And some of them, you know, the parents help them through school as much as they can, and there's scholarships. But to see people that really want that education and to realize that they go home and they talk to their parents about the stuff they're learning, and it opens everything up backwards too. You know, I'll have kids come to class the next week and they'll go, oh my God, Kathy Valentine from the Go-Go's was my final 2 years ago. My final is I get a quote unquote famous person to come in and I interview them for about an hour and a half. So there's enough that I don't have to read the same final from everybody, but you produce a feature profile, you know, and I run everybody all over the room. And I had 3 kids say, oh, I had no idea like punk rock went back that far, or girls could do it too, or just the conversations that had happened at home. And what some of my students found out about their parents was awesome, you know, and that's learning too.
Alexander, you ever have the problem of reading the same essay over and over?
Well, when you have 300 students in a class, fortunately, I have excellent teaching assistants who prevent that from happening on a regular basis. But I did want to take it back to the question of ancestors and elders a little bit. Obviously, when you teach history, at one level, the ancestors are right up there in front of you. You know, if you're going to explain Kendrick Lamar, you've got to explain Dr. Dre, which means you explain George Clinton, which means you explain James Brown, which means you explain Ray Charles and Muddy Waters, and you can keep going back and back and back. And so the ancestors are inherent in it. And I think one of the things that I have learned, obviously, from Dave, from Craig, from all the historians and critics of popular music over the years is that, again, you give people that context, tell them their history, and they'll understand something better about the world that they're in the present. The other thing that I think it does is I think that it conveys that knowledge and wisdom can come from a lot of different places. A lot of students come from the assumption that music is pretty slight, right? That it doesn't necessarily have meaning. And we do live in a manufactured age, and popular culture by definition is partly about manufacturing art. And so it's easy to trivialize it, but the artists are always pushing back against that. They're always looking to convey wisdom and some kind of truth in the work that they are doing. And so I think that one of the things that I try to explain is that you can get that wisdom from people outside of the credentialed folks, right? That you can get it from there, and that's, you know, Dave Marsh, as again I think Grail Marcus pointed out, is an autodidact, right? He didn't go to college. He is a scholar of the world because he chose to be and chose to find that knowledge and wisdom on his own. I have people in my family who are that way. My 2 parents are the first 2 in the family to go to college. And so, you know, you learn through your life experience, and hopefully by teaching about this material, to the students that knowledge and wisdom can come from a lot of places. Although I do want to add, whenever you make that statement, you always have to think a little bit about the anti-intellectualism that can come with that. The scholars are some of the ancestors too, and they bring ideas and background and history that's valuable and wise. And so I don't want to leave that part or that stone unturned, because that's part of the story too.
Amen. We're going to be moving to the questions soon. Well, Danny will come back. But as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking about, I work with K-12 teachers in Colorado during the summers frequently. Many of who do things like teach at the Cesar Chavez academies and things like that, bilingual groups. And when we work in that program, it's Masters of Arts in Teaching program, they inevitably hammer the issue of, yeah, but the people in my institution hate everything I'm doing. And to some extent, most of us here have managed to end run that one way or another. Music, who cares, right? Be an adjunct, be exploited labor like Alexander is, do your own thing or whatnot. But do you have any thoughts to share with teachers as they try to realize some version of this vision in an institution or a set of institutions that may not value? Or a lot of times, that's putting it mildly, that hate what they're doing. Carvel, you've been on the front lines in this in a certain way.
Again, the readings hint to this too. Louise talks about getting parents, teachers, students, even administrators moving in the direction of teaching and teaching and learning. But many of the rules and the things that the guidances come from politicians, because they tell you what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. The James Baldwin article speaks very directly to why it is that our objective, teaching and learning, is very different than those who are telling us what. And I think that has to be acknowledged. Everybody doesn't have the same objective. The people who are telling me what I'm supposed to be doing, they don't have my same objective. But I don't care. That's if I'm doing what I want to do, I'm doing what I feel is important in my community, to the people who and I don't mean that I'm not talking Black, Hispanic. I'm just talking to. I'm just speaking to, there are people who are trying to tell us what we're supposed to do. They have a different objective than the people who are doing the actual work. And I don't, I really don't let that bother me. It's helpful that I teach music. So when I write a lesson plan and I say the students, the objective will be to learn, be able to play quarter notes at 60 beats per minute or whatever, the administrator has no idea what that means anyway. So I even unless I get written up, I don't even do lesson plans anymore, because no one reads them, and they don't even notice that I don't do them anymore now. So the fact that I'm overlooked is good, and some teachers may not be in that situation, but whatever your objective is in teaching the students that are in front of you, that has to be paramount over some of the things that come down to you, because they have different objectives. And there's a whole different discussion. And again, I think that James Baldwin article speaks much more directly to that. There's a whole different objective going on there, and it affects everyone. It affects all of us. So we're doing the most important work, not the people telling us what to do.
Absolutely. Luis.
Well, I like what Carval's saying, because I think when you're in an institution, any institution, you're imprisoned in it. And that includes when you're in prisons. You know what I'm saying? So one of the things is to expand the classroom. The world is your classroom, not my class, not this little moment, not me being your teacher in front of you. It's like the whole world has got to be engaged in what you're giving them, and get them to walk around thinking about what you're telling them or talking about, so that they see it in the world. You know what I'm saying? They learn from others. They see what you're pointing out by either reading on their own or just talking to people. It's like they say, you're planting seeds that you hope will grow. They get nurtured out there. It's a concept that somebody told me was carefully supervised neglect. You know what it is you got to let them go, and they're in the world. You get your kids in the classroom, or even whatever, students, maybe college, prisoners, wherever they are. But the real learning happens outside the classroom, and that's what you want to bring in, and you want to let them know your learning is going to happen outside this. Whatever seeds you plant, you hope can get nurtured by the interactions and the wisdoms they seek, and the people that they deal with, and the books that they read on their own. That's what I think it's important to just expand the whole classroom to the world. Whatever it is you're teaching, get them to do it on their own. Also, because it teaches them to own their own education. They're owning it. It's like somebody once said, discipline, the only discipline that matters is self-discipline. So when you teach discipline, it's really so they can be self-disciplined to keep learning on their own.
Alexander.
I would say a couple things. First, having watched the Herculean efforts that many teachers have put in to teach my own kids throughout this pandemic, I feel for them. They're being asked the impossible now. They were being asked the impossible before. As Carvel was saying, changing lesson plans, handed down by administrators and politicians at every level of government from one year to the next, new preps, all of the things that go with that. It's so difficult to get into a groove and feel comfortable with what you're teaching under those circumstances. But one thing that I did notice during the pandemic, and this goes for my teaching as well, is that I think there were moments of real empathy and vulnerability between the teachers and the students that are not always so apparent when you're in a classroom trying to physically get through 8 hours of teaching and mentally get through the tasks at hand and your lesson plans or whatever has been required of you, that there was room to breathe and share that sense of discomfort in the situation that you're in, and a sense that everyone's in it together. I hope some of that hangs on after the pandemic is over, and that more teachers feel comfortable sharing that feeling, because that, I know that teachers are always concerned, especially at the primary and secondary level, at control in a classroom, and in college too. But there are other ways to create a community and create a space that works. And I think that sense of empathy and vulnerability does work. It gives students a sense that the teachers understand what they're going through, and a sense of everyone's shared humanity. The one other thing I'll say, which takes it back to what I talked about at the beginning, find a way in all of those dusty plans and textbooks to share the joy about the subject matter, which is the reason you were there in the first place. It's easy to lose it. But if you continue to share your joy for what you're teaching, at least some of the students will follow.
Paula.
I totally agree with what you're saying, Alexander. The more empathy you have for where those kids are, and the more you can engage them where they are, sometimes I found the less control I needed, because everybody did pull together. And sometimes it's hard to have faith in kids that are, by the time I get to them, they're disappointed in the system. They can't figure out. I've had kids say to me, why are you the only one that tells me this stuff? And I'm not going to dog somebody who's, chained to a curriculum or expectations. I say, well, I think there are a lot of ways to learn. And I'm an adjunct, so I don't have to do it like the teachers do it. And my dad used to challenge me when I would say, oh, that teacher's so boring. Well, figure out what they're telling you, find something interesting. And he would challenge me to engage my teachers. We had one who would take crayons out on the weekend and rub headstones. But once she felt engaged, it was strange how much more Mrs. Griffin wanted to pull us into her world and see what our worlds were. And the other thing, because it's amazing the amount of work teachers do, is encouraging them to bring that personal vulnerability into the classroom and to let the students understand what all goes into teaching them. And, I always say, I don't have all the answers, and you may hate what I think about your favorite band, but I can back up my reasons, and I want you to bring me your reasons. Like, I love being wrong. I love being wrong, and I love getting to figure out something I didn't understand. So this is a two-way street.
Amen. Yeah, one of the things I tell the students in that situation, or they figure out themselves, more to the point, is that a big piece of it is learning to mask, to use the Afro-American tradition. Put up, when the administration comes to you and asks you what you're doing, don't, for Christ's sake, tell them the truth. Yeah, I'm teaching them to play 16th notes in 5/8 time. No, what you're teaching them to do is listen carefully and think 9 times as fast as the people making those rules for you. I think probably we're at question time. Danny, you want to come in? This has been fantastic. Throughout this entire thing, I've been thinking about Ralph Ellison defines the jazz impulse as a matter of constantly redefining yourself as an individual, as a member of a community, and as a link in the chain of tradition. And whether I go into reading the room, like Luis said, whether I go into a room or a classroom or now a Zoom thing, what we're doing is we're modeling how you make a community and make it with your own voice sounding. And you better damn well be listening to each other for that to happen. Namaste. Thank you. Danny.
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed this as a teacher myself. There's so many things I want to respond to, from how much I hated school myself to the fact that adjuncts rule, Holly, or at least they should, right? I mean, they're terribly important. So here's a question that kind of picks up where Holly left off. Can you talk about how you've learned from students, maybe even when they may have checked you in a productive way, maybe by sharing some specific examples?
Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, anyway, we can go around. Yes.
Go around. Holly?
I've had this kid, and as an adjunct, I don't have educational background. One of the things that I've had to learn is, how do you reach past those folded arms? And it's not always, well, if you don't participate, there goes your grade, because they may be struggling and they may be doing that because they don't want to show their friends they don't know. Right. And it's taught me new layers of empathy and new questions to ask about people that I have certainly taken out of the classroom. And I had a student end up in Vanderbilt Psych that we didn't know she was struggling. And, one thing led to another. I had this student who came in a long trench coat. We all know that kid. And the last day of class, he was the last person to say thank you. And you could tell he was going to tell me something, and I was terrified. And what he told me was, I'm blogging. So even when you think you're failing, I've learned that you just keep showing up and doing the best you can, because they may not show you, but it may be working.
Luis, you're nodding.
I really believe that's true. And I think it's about incorporating their challenges. I mean, I even sometimes when a classroom or a group of people don't challenge me, I even say, challenge me, people. I'm telling you all these things, challenge me, or whatever. it's in their questions, but also sometimes they don't really agree with you or they're not sure. I said, look, this is the place to do it. I love challenges. It actually adds for more teaching, I think, if you get challenged. And I get the idea of people that don't want to, they don't like what you're saying, but I encourage it. Just look at, challenge me. Well, I'll give you one example, and I try to be quick about this. I was at a high school in Chicago, and they wanted me to come and work with, this is a school with 18 gangs. I mean, 2/3 of the kids were dropped out by the time they got to senior year. And so I had this one terrible class where there was, I mean, I walked in there and the teacher was there and she was on the floor, literally just on the floor, just sitting there, all exhausted. The kids were throwing stuff. You know, it was like the rowdy kids. So I had them all come together and I tried to prompt them to do some writing. Okay, I gave them a different prompt, but one prompt was, tell me about the most important person in your life. And for some reason, one of the kids, the kid that was the most rowdy, started writing about his grandmother. I don't know why it got him going, but it turned out that his grandmother had just died 2 weeks before. And that's when he really lost it. And when he got up to read, because I actually encouraged him to read, and nobody wanted to read, they're all nah. But he got up and read. His courage was powerful. And he read that thing about his grandmother. He even cried. This is a tough guy in this classroom, high school. He's crying about his grandmother. It was like maybe the first time that he had a chance to express this, because nobody ever asked him, why are you causing problems? He came in there and it changed the whole room. Everybody after that calmed down and wanted to read their pieces. Everybody, he changed the whole room. And I remember the teacher getting up, walking out to the hallway, screaming to other teachers, there's a miracle in my classroom, but it wasn't a miracle. It's what you can do when, again, you properly bring in the challenges, the pains, the hurts, everything help that's there in the world can be a teaching tool for them to understand what you're trying to do.
Right on. Ever been challenged, Alexander?
I have been on a few occasions. You know, I think the challenge is that when you have hundreds of students, you have students from every walk of life in your classroom in the first place. And so you know, you talked earlier about the call and response, and I really think about the feedback I get when I teach as part of that call and response. I'm going to get students who do or do not understand what I say for all kinds of reasons, from every perspective, from every class, you know, gender, race, background that you can imagine, regional, international, right? Some students who know nothing about American history, some who have studied it for their entire lives. And what that does is it gives me a better sense of who they are if I continue to ask. Which I try to do, but then it also helps me to teach it better. You know, every time I hear one of those voices, that goes into the mix when I think about how I'm going to turn a phrase or how I'm going to contextualize something that I talk about. The other thing I was going to mention about sort of learning from the students is just the simple question that I get to ask as someone who teaches music history. What are you listening to? Now, first of all, from a practical perspective, they're doing my job for me because I get to keep up on the music without having to find it myself, which I, of course, love to do anyway. But it's also a route to learning about them, right? First of all, they know you care enough to hear what they're listening to, and then you ask them why, and it goes from there to much deeper places. So I think those are the two spaces in which I feel like I learned the most from the students in my day-to-day, week-to-week experience as a teacher.
Carvel.
Yeah, I think that there's never a time that I'm not challenged, because it depends on because from when I walk in the room, almost every single student, what they're doing is telling me, you can't teach me. You're not going to teach me. You might think you're going to teach me. You're not teaching me anything. So that my challenge is, you know, how do I try and teach the students that could care less that I'm standing in front of them? And I have to really, really agree with Alexander. One of the very first things that I do is ask them what they're listening to. In fact, I kind of have this my classroom procedures thing. The very first thing I do it is just to get to know students. And almost the very first question is, but I do it in a way I actually have them talk to each other and do some things. I kind of have a kind of a skillful way that I do it. But it is, what are you listening to? And well, who's your favorite artist? Who do you really not like? And the thing that always amazes me, and what I learn every single year, is that the students that young kids now know much more about music than I ever did when I was their age. They have huge spectrums of music that they listen to, that I have no idea how they ever would have come about that music. The stereotype of what you think a Compton kid is listening to, you are absolutely wrong. I don't care who you are. You're absolutely wrong. They have this incredible spectrum of music that they listen to, and I have no understanding of how they come across the music. And once you actually get them to delve into it and kind of argue with the other kid next to them about who they like and who they don't like and who's important, you find out how they really, how much they really know, not only how much they really know, but how much it really means to them. I mean, from everything. I have a kid who, he listens to klezmer music. How do you get into listening to klezmer music? I mean, I just don't, I don't understand how they get to where they get to, but they're adamant about what they like, and they would never ever have that conversation, especially in a classroom with their peers, without coming into a classroom where they don't know everybody. And so I do it at the beginning, and without having asked that question, just like Alexander just said. So absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, last panel, James Bernard, founder of The Source and XXL magazines, said his 13-year-old daughter is deeply into Susie and the Banshees. I am going to listen to Susie and the Banshees for the first time in quite some while, a little later on today. Danny, I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, and we didn't get through them all, but this is an interesting one for closing too here. So I work with teachers, and I'm trying to explore the idea that lesson planning can be like planning a concert set list. And the same rules, open big, close big, et cetera, apply to effective teaching. How do you each incorporate performing into your own teaching?
You get to go last on this one, Carvel. Alexander, let's start with you.
Teaching large lectures is performance. It is part of the experience, from the fact that I warm up my voice and stretch out before I get up there, to the fact that, I know I'm telling a story from beginning to end. And it's about providing a narrative, providing breaks. I think that's something to really, if you're thinking about a set list in the way that you teach and you set your lesson plans, make sure that you're not going at full blast the entire time. That is not going to work. There have to be quiet moments, and there have to be louder moments. And, if you're truly thinking about that set list like storytelling, then you need to figure out what those 2 or 3 points that you really want to get across are, because that's all you're really going to get across in one class period is 2 or 3 points, and the rest of it is context and the wisdom and knowledge that comes around it. So build around the 3 big songs, whether they go beginning, middle, and end, or whether you put them somewhere else, and then fill in the rest around that.
And I'm just going to put a footnote on this. I learned to think about how to listen to concerts from Dave Marsh's chapter on the way Bruce put his concert set lists together. I think that's in the Glory Days book. But yeah, Holly.
One of the things that I found finding my way as an adjunct is if I explain what we're going to do, treat my first chunk of the day as I'm the opening act, I get the students reading their work to each other and helping them find their voice. To me, that's everything. And then I teach a 3-hour seminar. So we break, we come back and it's the same thing. Let's talk about what we're going to learn, what we learned here. Let's talk about what we're going to learn next. And then to close, I try to throw it back to the kids. What do you guys want to know? What do you want to do? What do you hope to get out of this assignment now that you know what it is? It's a really nice thing. You know, some rock stars are me, and some rock stars are you. I'd like to be a you rock star.
Nice. Luis.
You know, when you're a performance poet, you're always talking about the dichotomy between the page and stage. But I've worked both ends of it, and I look at a classroom as a stage. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm being phony. You know what I mean? It's not artifice, but it does mean, as Alexander and Holly are pointing out, you have to be aware that you're now have an audience, you know, and you got to think about the rhythm of that classroom, as we're pointing out, when to bring in the important big things, when to slow it down a little bit, when to bring in something else. And one thing that I get to do, which I love, is I get to read poetry as part of the class. And people love that. If I'm talking about poetry, I got to read poetry. Since I work in all genres, I will read parts of plays I've written short stories, my novels. I read sections. I have so much I can draw from, and I don't need permission from anybody because I draw from my own work, even though obviously it's great to read from others, and obviously it's great to have other work. So I think for me, it's mastery of both the page and the stage when you're teaching in the classroom.
Carvel, bring us home.
I have a very, you know, it's a lot of people think that, especially like for you know, adolescents, 12-year-olds that, or, you know, teenagers, that they don't want structure. And I find that they actually do want structure. They just don't want something that they don't take part in. So I have a very structured class, and a lot of people don't believe me when I say that, because I actually ask, like I tell counselors, you can send me any kid. I have like the worst kids in the school, you know, or other teachers, you know, will complain about, you know, this kid is this and this and this, and they'll tell me all about that. And I'll say, hey, I don't have that same experience. That doesn't mean that they don't act out in my class. I have all of that going on in my class, but I have a very structured classroom, so they know what to expect. And I think what happens is when the students that I'm working with don't know what to expect, it really makes things much more difficult for them. And when they do know what to expect, because what happens is that structure happens over time, right? And I open the things that I'm opening up with, like Alexander talking about, is me learning about you before we ever start anything, and learning about each other. Who all's in this room, and like Luis was talking about, you know, reading the room and figuring, and then as time goes by, I do, you know, impose that structure, but it is something that feels like we're doing together, because I've designed all of that into my lesson plan, that it really is about us figuring these things. Now I'm teaching, but I'm never standing up there lecturing. You know, I'm not reading poetry. I'm not doing anything. In fact, in the middle school classroom, I rarely played my own my instrument in class. I probably will a lot more in high school. And it really just has more to do with the way that I want them to engage with the music, and us work together. But in the middle school classroom, I rarely ever played. Now they love to hear me play when I do, and that type of thing, but it comes way later. I just make everything about them, and I put a lot of time and a lot of effort into figuring that room out and figuring out how to guide that room into the structure that I need it to be. But I'm guiding that in a way that I'm listening to them at all times. So it feels like they're they're leading into that structure, because everything that I'm teaching them, there's a reason. They know the reason that I want them to learn that. So, you know, I think that's probably the best I can do with that answer.
It's good, man. I've been with you guys anytime. Thank you so much for doing this. And Eric.
That was wonderful. Thank you all so much. Believe it or not, we only have one more panel left, but it's going to be a great one in about 45 minutes with John Sayles, Bobby Ann Mason, and Gretchen Peters talking with Lorenzo Wolf about songs and stories. This has been great. Thank you all so much. And everything is archived on our YouTube channel and on the Land of Hope and Dreams website. See you all in about 45 minutes.